urban exploration horror stories. I've never had a lot of friends, but that never really bothered me. I'm the kind of guy who does things alone anyway. A lot of people think that's weird, but whatever. One of the few things that interests me is urban exploration, checking out abandoned places, seeing what's left behind, taking a few pictures. So, when I heard about the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, I figured I'd make the drive and check it out. I'd read a little about the place. It used to be a massive mental hospital back in the day, the kind where they did lobotomies and electroshock therapy, classic horror movie stuff. It closed down in the 90s, but parts of it was still standing, and that's what I wanted to see. Of course, most of it had been torn down or turned into apartments, but I'd heard there were still a few original buildings hidden in the back, deep in the woods. It took me a while to find a way in, but after wandering around the perimeter, I found a hole in the fence. I squeezed through and made my way up the overgrown path. The building loomed in front of me, windows shattered, doors barely hanging on their hinges. It looked like a skeleton of its former self. Inside, it was cold and damp. Even though it was a pretty warm day outside, the air smelled like mold and old wood, and the walls were covered in graffiti. It was dead silent, except for the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling. I walked slowly, taking it all in. The place was a maze of long, dark hallways, all leading to empty rooms where patients used to live. I was halfway down one of these hallways when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like someone was dragging their feet. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. It was coming from one of the rooms up ahead. I told myself it was probably just an animal or maybe the wind pushing debris around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I walked a little closer, and the noise stopped. I was standing right outside one of the rooms now. The door was half open, creaking softly in the draft. I don't know why, but I pushed it open, just to see what was inside. At first, it looked like an ordinary room, peeling wallpaper, broken bed frame, the usual. But then I saw her. There, leaning against the far wall, was an old woman. She was dressed in this faded, old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white photo. She was hunched over, staring at the floor, her grey hair hanging in front of her face. I stood there, frozen. I didn't know what to do. My brain was racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone was still living here, especially not an old woman like her. But she was real. I could hear her breathing. She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and looked right at me. Her eyes were sunken and dark, like she hadn't slept in years. And then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was this wide, unnatural grin that stretched way too far across her face. That was enough for me. I didn't wait to see what she was going to do next. I bolted, slamming the door behind me and sprinting back down the hallway. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was out of the building and back through the hole in the fence. When I finally got back to my car, I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was just some squatter or maybe my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Ha ha, I have stolen Misfit Horror's voice. Subscribe so I don't also take his soul. You can always unsubscribe later, so there's nothing to lose. Plus, it's free. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. It's up to you, viewer. Now enjoy the rest of these scary, true urban exploration stories. Ha 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 ha. I never liked working alone. My job at the old factory complex was usually pretty boring. Sitting in the booth, doing rounds, making sure no one got inside. But the place was huge, and it was easy to get paranoid when it was just me. The company was cheap though, and any time my coworker called in sick, they'd stick me on solo shifts. Just one guy patrolling a massive abandoned factory. Not exactly the best deterrent, but it's what they did. The factory had been shut down for years, since before I started working there. It used to manufacture God knows what, but now it was just a decaying maze of empty buildings, rusted machinery, and old loading docks. The lights barely worked, and half the time it felt like I was walking through a ghost town. That night, I was doing my usual routine, sitting in the security booth, watching the cameras, and every hour or so, walking around to check for any signs of trouble. Usually, the biggest issue was keeping out kids who wanted to explore or tag the place with graffiti. The area was fenced off, but determined people could always find a way in. I was just finishing up around when I noticed something odd on one of the camera feeds. It was the back entrance, the side closest to the woods. A group of people, maybe 6 or 7 of them, were walking straight towards the factory. At first, I thought they were just more thrill seekers, maybe a bunch of teens looking to mess around in the old building. But as I zoomed in on the feed, I noticed something was off. They weren't dressed like normal explorers. They were wearing long, dark robes, hoods pulled up to cover their faces, and they weren't just casually walking either. They were moving in a straight line, almost in unison, like they had a purpose. My first thought was some weird prank. Maybe they were trying to film a horror video for YouTube, but as they reached the entrance, they all stopped at the same time, turning to look at each other. Then, without a word, they entered the building. Now, I'm not easily spooked, but I wasn't exactly eager to approach a group of people dressed like a cult, wandering into an abandoned factory. Still, it was my job to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and started towards the back of the building. My hand was already hovering over my phone, ready to call the cops if things got weird. When I reached the back entrance, I stepped inside and immediately heard soft murmuring, like chanting. My heart started racing as I moved quietly down the hall, following the sounds. It was coming from one of the large production rooms, the ones that would hardly ever check because no one could easily get to them without being noticed. But these people, whoever they were, had made it there without me even seeing them in person. As I approached the room, I could see them now. They had formed a circle in the middle of the floor, each of them standing perfectly still, heads bowed. In the center of the circle, there was some kind of symbol, something large, maybe drawn in chalk or paint. I couldn't make it out from where I was standing, but the whole thing felt wrong. I called out,
"Hey, security! You need to get out of here!"
My voice echoed through the factory, but none of them moved. The chanting, though, stopped. Dead silence. Then, slowly, they all turned to face me at once. I couldn't see their faces beneath the hoods, but I could feel their eyes locked on me. For a second, no one moved. We just stood there, staring at each other. And then, without warning, they all sprinted toward me. I didn't think, didn't wait. I turned and ran. My flashlight bounced in my hand as I sprinted down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps pounding behind me. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear them getting closer, their breath heavy, their feet slapping against the concrete. I made it out of the building and saw my car in the distance, parked just outside the booth. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, not daring to look back. I could feel them closing in, their presence right behind me. I slammed into my car, fumbling for my keys, and barely managed to get the door open before I threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut just as the first fist hit the window, then another. The entire group was there, surrounding the car, banging on the windows, kicking at the doors. The glass started to crack under the force of their hits. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and floored the gas. As I peeled out of the parking lot, one of them darted in front of me. I didn't have time to stop. There was a sickening thud as the car bounced, but I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. I stumbled out of the car and ran inside, breathless and rambling about the group at the factory. The cops didn't really know what to make of it, but they sent a few officers to check it out. I sat there in the station for what felt like hours, trying to calm down. Finally, one of the officers came back. He said they didn't find anyone at the factory, no sign of the group I'd seen. But they did find something. In the exact spot where I'd seen the group standing, there was a pentagram drawn on the floor, surrounded by strange markings. The officer told me it looked like some kind of ritual site, but there was no trace of anyone being there. I never went back to that factory after that. I quit the next day. It was Mike's idea to check out our old elementary school. We hadn't been there in years, not since they shut it down a few months ago. Sunland Park Elementary used to be the center of our little town in El Paso, Texas, but budget cuts and declining enrollment turned it into just another forgotten place. The last time we saw it, they boarded up the windows, put up a chain-link fence, and left it to rot. We were bored, hanging out at Mike's place when he suggested we head over there. I wasn't really in the mood, but I didn't want to seem like a pussy either. "Come on, man," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "How often is it that we get to explore a place that we actually know?" I agreed. The idea of walking through our old school, the place where we spent years playing on the jungle gym and messing around in class, sounded kind of cool. But it wasn't exactly the same place anymore. Now, it was just another abandoned building, probably crawling with rats and worse. When we got there, the place looked even worse than I imagined. The fence was still up, but parts of it had been cut open, letting in anyone who wanted to sneak through. We crawled through the gap and stood in front of the entrance. The windows were smashed, and graffiti covered the walls. I remembered how it used to look, with bright colors and kids running everywhere. Now, it was just dead. We got inside pretty easily. The front doors were unlocked, probably from someone else breaking in earlier. Once we stepped in, it hit me how weird it felt. It was like the whole building was frozen in time, but with everything covered in dust and decay. There were still old desks and chairs scattered around, like the teachers left in a hurry and never came back. We wandered down the hallway, our footsteps echoing off the tile floors. Everything looked smaller than I remember, probably because we'd grown so much since we were last there. I couldn't shake this eerie feeling though, like the place was watching us. Every creak or random noise had me on edge, but I didn't want to let Mike see that. We passed by the old gym, where the door was barely hanging on its hinges. Mike wanted to check it out, but I was more interested in our old classrooms. Room 204 was where we had Mrs. Jensen for 3rd grade, and I was curious to see if anything was still there. I nudged Mike, and we headed that way. As we were walking, I noticed something. Footsteps that weren't ours. They were faint, coming from further down the hall, but they definitely weren't the sounds we were making. I glanced at Mike, and he heard it too. We abruptly stopped, straining to listen. "Hello?" Mike called out, but his voice cracked a little, and I could tell he was freaked. We didn't hear anything in response, but the footsteps kept coming. I turned my flashlight down the hall, and that's when we saw him. A guy standing near the end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, and wore this ragged hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was partially obscured, but I could tell he was staring right at us. My stomach twisted in knots. For a second, I thought about bolting towards the entrance, but I felt like I couldn't move. The guy took a step toward us, and Mike whispered, "Run!" But before we could take off, the guy raised his hands, like he was showing he wasn't a threat. He didn't say anything at first, just kept his hands up, walking toward us slowly. "You guys shouldn't be here," he finally said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a while. "I ain't gonna hurt you, but trust me, this ain't the kind of place you want to be hanging out." We didn't respond right away, mostly because we were both still freaking out. But something about the way he talked calmed me down a little. He wasn't rushing us, wasn't trying to scare us anymore. Mike spoke first. Do you live here?" The guy shrugged, looking away for a second before nodding. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Don't got nowhere else to go." He stepped closer. Now I could see him better. He looked rough, like life had chewed him up and spat him out. His eyes were tired, his face gaunt. We relaxed a bit, realizing he wasn't some psycho or anything. Just a guy down on his luck, probably just using the school as a place to crash. He leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. I've seen kids like you come in here before, thinking it's some kind of playground. But it ain't safe here, man. You don't know what kind of people you run into around here. He chuckled dryly. Lucky for you, I'm the harmless kind. Mike and I stood there, unsure of what to say. It was weird, standing in the hallway of our old school, talking to this random dude who'd probably been living in the place for months. It was awkward, but it didn't feel dangerous anymore. Just sad. Well, thanks for the heads up, Mike said, finally breaking the silence. Yeah, the guy replied, giving us a half smile. Just take care of yourselves. This place ain't what it used to be. We nodded, and without another word, we headed back the way we came. I didn't want to push it by asking more questions, and honestly, I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked back to the entrance, I glanced over my shoulder. The guy was still leaning against the wall, watching us leave, but he didn't follow. When we got outside, the fresh air hit me, and I realized I had been holding my breath for way too long. Mike and I didn't talk much on the way home. I think we were both trying to process what just happened. Sunland was our childhood, but seeing what it's become, I don't think we'll go back anytime soon.